What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you my competitive tier list for the February 2021 format. Blazing Vortex comes out later on this week, and although we don't expect a lot to change as a result of that set, I want to make sure I bring you guys this tier list so that you guys are fully prepared for any tournaments you may play in, or if you're just playing online, so that way you know how the meta is stacking up and what you want to prepare yourselves against. So let's go ahead and head on over to Tier Maker and get right into it. So if this is your first time seeing a tier list video, I'm going to go ahead and give you a quick rundown of the tiers. We've got tier 0, 1, 2, rogue, and everything else. The breakdown here is very simple. The higher up the tier, that means it has either high representation or the power of the deck just far outclasses anything else that is beneath it. And so you're going to start to see this sort of pyramid shape of sorts as we go up the tier list. So let's go ahead and get started. First up is Burning Abyss. I'm just throwing this into everything else. People love BA, but it's just not really putting up the numbers. It's unfortunate, but there really isn't much else to say. People are really trying to make this deck work. It's a cool combo deck. You can actually even play it control now because we're in a slower format, but it's just not really happening. Virtual World. I've got Virtual World in the tier 1 slot. I think this is probably the best deck of the format. That is obviously debatable, but when it comes to Virtual World, so many people are focused on Drytron, as a matter of fact. I guess I should go ahead and just cover that now since we're already mentioning it, but so many people are focused on Drytron at the moment that this has given rise to Virtual World to be able to ascend up the ladder, and I feel that's why in this past weekend at the LCS 3v3, we saw more people on Virtual World than Drytron, and the conversion rate for Virtual World was actually better than Drytron, so that's actually a very interesting sign. We know a lot of people are side decking cards for Drytron, such as Ally of Justice, Cycle Reader, and all these other cards that can really just hinder the deck, like Droll and Lockbird and the like, and so with that opportunity, Virtual World doesn't really care about some of these cards, and so the deck is still incredibly strong. It just may not be able to do the same things that Drytron can. It's just powerful in its own way, but regardless, these are probably going to be the two most represented decks that you're going to see in the current format. So if you're playing in any tournament or if you're playing online, expect to see both of these decks a lot because they are the best decks. You are able to go into some crazy plays like Calamities with Virtual World, like Vanity's Ruler, or even Herald of Ultimateness, or any of the other shenanigans that Drytron is able to pull off. These decks are going to be everywhere, so if there's two decks to focus on the most, make sure you're prepared to play these two. Moving on along, we've got Infernoble Knight. I'm actually going to throw this in the rogue tier. There was actually a reasonable amount of players on Infernoble Knight in the LCS 3v3, and even if you're looking on the online ladder, there's actually a reasonable amount of people that are piloting this deck still. This deck is actually still fairly okay, even with the hits that it suffered on the most recent Forbidden and Limited list, and I think the deck's still very playable. It may not be the powerhouse that it was a few formats ago. We're in obviously a much slower format now, but that's okay. I think people are still happy that they can play this deck, even if it may not be to the full power it once was. It's not unplayable, and I actually like when that is the case, when there's a wider breadth of decks for people to choose from. I think that's generally a good thing. Next up, we have Altergeist. I'm actually just going to throw this in rogue as well. There's a reasonable amount of people that were playing Altergeist in the past weekend's LCS, and this deck's win rate online is actually still very formidable. It's definitely fallen down in terms of how many people are playing it, but its win percentage based on the number of people that are playing the deck, I actually think warrant it to be in this roguish tier. It's a decent deck. Again, we know trap decks are actually like pretty good right now, and so Altergeist has been one of the best before, and we're going to probably continue to see that trend. ABC in everything else, I'm still not feeling it with this deck. ABC can do a lot of really cool things, but in this particular format, who knows, maybe there's someone out there who will just be able to excel with it and maybe do very well. I've seen a few people like in their local remote duels actually have a little bit of success with the deck, but besides that, it hasn't been doing a whole lot. Next up is actually a deck we have never talked about before, and that is Liralusk Tri Brigade. This is such a cool deck, and I love that this deck has actually come to light. I'm going to throw this in the rogue tier, but I'm actually going to put this towards the top of the rogue category. So if you've never seen Liralusk Tri Brigade, it's obviously a hybrid deck of both the Liralusk engine and the Tri Brigade engine, and both of these archetypes just synergize together very well. You've got the power of the Tri Brigades being able to banish all these materials to just summon and cheat out monsters from the extra deck for free. The Liralusks are cool because you can go into these rank 1 plays that actually don't require you to use your normal summon, that allow you to attack your opponent directly, and you probably already know where this is going because then you can slam down a Zeus and you can equalize the board. board, and then since all of your cards essentially will generate value off of the Tri Brigade half of the deck, then you're able to help reset your board like after a Zeus, and that's just insane. This deck is super, super cool. A lot of people are experimenting with this deck and really just want to try it out, and I actually want to put this as a rogue pick. Now, this deck is on the rise, and it could potentially go up further, but for now, I don't think it really justifies going any further than this, although there are some top players that are considering playing this at the moment. I just think when you look at the rest of the metagame, it really doesn't really warrant going above that rogue tier, although if there was like a tier 2.5, I would definitely have Liralusk Tri Brigade in there, which is why I put it at the top of rogue. Next up is Guru. This is like similar to Altergeist. Like I want to put this in rogue, but I think I'm going to throw this towards like the top of everything else. I've been seeing this actually do like a fair bit at like the lower levels of competitive play, and the deck is like fine, but again, I just think if you're going to play a trap deck, there's much better options, but I'm going to put it at like the top end of everything else, or like the bottom end of rogue, just because I have been seeing it make a little bit of noise at the lower levels of play. The deck is fine. Dragon Maid's another deck I'm going to throw into everything else. This was a deck that I wanted to preemptively talk about because in the OCG, our meta was actually trending in a similar fashion as theirs, and Dragon Maid was actually seeing a bit of a rise. And so with that said, our meta definitely hasn't been exactly like theirs, and obviously their card pool is different. So with a lot of differences in mind, maybe it wasn't the right call, but there are some decks that are taking advantage of the Dragon Maid cards. One in particular is Dragon Link, which I'll throw up here so you guys can see for now, but I just don't think this deck's doing too much at the moment. And again, our meta is not trending exactly like theirs is, so it's something that you don't really have to worry about. Dragon Link, however, is another deck that has actually really impressed me over the past couple of weeks. In the most recent LCS, this deck actually had a reasonable amount of representation, and it actually converted quite well into the top cut. This was a deck that I had in the rogue category with Infernoble for the last couple videos like this, but I'm actually going to put this up into tier 2 because I think the Dragon Link players have finally figured out how to make this deck work in this particular format. Remember, Dragon Link has a ton of one-card starters that ultimately result in these really hard-to-break boards, and even going second, the deck can actually play through a reasonable amount of disruption, and with the way the meta is organized now, it may be Dragon Link's time to re-enter the metagame, because a lot of these cards that people are playing to combat stuff, such as Virtual World, such as Drytron, may not be as much of an issue when you're playing Dragon Link, and so as a result, people might be flocking back to that deck, and the deck is really strong. Anyone who played in the past several months knows how devastating Dragon Link can be, and yes, you don't have your Destruction Sword, yes, you don't have your Link Cross, it doesn't matter, the deck doesn't need it, the deck is still incredibly strong without them, and so I think we're going to see a rise of Dragon Link within this next month before we get to the March ban list. I have a feeling, just based off of what I've seen both from the LCS as well as in the online format as well, that Dragon Link is definitely on a rise. Next up, we have Eldritch. I'm throwing Eldritch at tier 1. Now, this is a bit of a weird one because there's like 5 different Eldritch variants going around at the moment. We've got like Pure Eldritch, Dragoon Eldritch, there's Zodiac Eldritch, there's Dogmatica Eldritch, and it just goes on, right? There's so many different ways to actually play Eldritch, but when it comes to Eldritch in particular, this is going to be the Zodiac Eldritch variant I want to discuss. I think this is probably the strongest of the bunch. Yes, there's arguments, pros and cons for all of them, but just across the board with the numbers, with the win rate, I think Zodiac Eldritch is at the top tier at the moment, but you really can't go wrong with a lot of the different Eldritch variants. Dragoon Eldritch is very strong because Dragoon is insane. Even stuff like Dogmatica Eldritch, there's even people playing hybrid variants of like Zodiac Dogmatica Eldritch, and they're doing just fine. I think there was actually one of those that took second place at the most recent LCS 3v3, so there's a lot of potential with Eldritch, right? And this deck has just continued to shine because of the fact the way the meta is shaping up, with trap cards being so relevant in this much slower format. This is the trap deck to play, and if you want to play the deck with the strongest inevitability, the strongest grind game, then Eldritch is going to be the deck that you want to pick. Next up is Emancipator, and similar to Liralusk Tri Brigade, I'm actually going to put this deck at the top of Rogue. This deck actually had an incredible showing this past weekend, with actually having a reasonable amount of people playing the deck and then actually converting into top cut as well. It's so weird. We're seeing these former best decks like Emancipator and Dragon Link actually re-entering the format, even if they are in their nerfed forms. Obviously, Emancipator doesn't have Block Dragon anymore, and Dragon Link doesn't have some access to its tools, but that doesn't stop these decks from being playable and actually doing rather well. Again, it just took some reconfiguring and re-engineering, and just like that, these decks are back. I think because we are in this control format and people are focusing so much on these top decks, it allows these other combo decks to come in because people aren't preparing to defeat these sort sort of combo decks, and these specific outs that some of these decks are playing, these decks don't really care about them. Stuff like Adamantipator and Dragon Link don't care about some of these specific niche control-oriented hand traps. You need to have much stronger tools to stop these decks, and so Adamantipator and Dragon Link, as a result, have been able to overrun and find a place in this particular metagame. Again, similar to Liralusk Tri Brigade, I actually want to put this in like a tier 2.5, or like the bottom of tier 2. I think similar to Dragon Link, you're going to start to see a lot more people on Adamantipator, because after watching it this past weekend, it was actually really impressive, and I think this deck has tons of potential in this format, so who knows what'll happen, but for now, I'm going to put it at the top of Rogue. Next up is Dogmatika. We're going to throw this into tier 2. Now, similar to Eldritch, there's a lot of Dogmatika variants, right? There's Dogmatika Eldritch, there's like Dogmatika Invoke, there's Dogmatika Shaddoll even, and so it's really difficult to kind of pinpoint one with this particular square, but the Dogmatika engine can be splashed in so many different decks, and I just want to really highlight that because the strength of the Dogmatika engine really cannot be understated when you have cards like Punishment, when you have stuff like Nadir's Servant that's just such a great consistency booster and can really just out a lot of like weird things. And with people splashing this in so many different decks, this really deserves a home at tier 2. This has been kind of like the go-to tier 2 deck for quite some time now, right? If you want to pinpoint like something specific, maybe like Invoke Dogmatika, which also had a good showing this past weekend, and online a lot of people just love to play the deck. Don't expect the Dogmatika engine to be going anywhere anytime soon because it is doing a lot of work. Oh boy, next up we got good old Mystic Mine. Now, this deck has not been doing anything. There's still been some people that have been like trying to side deck Mystic Mine to be cute, but to be honest, Mystic Mine is just not super great in a control-oriented format. Now, it's not bad against decks like Dragon Link or Adamantipator, so if these decks continue to trend upward and become more popular, Mystic Mine might be something that people want to revisit. However, with these three decks being like at the top of the metagame, it's really difficult, right? I mean, Virtual World has like Chuche, you've also got Eldritch just having cards that can also natively out Mystic Mine as well. When a deck can natively out Mystic Mine, there really is no point to main deck it or even side deck it, because then your way of actually winning the game is just completely gone. But keep in mind that for these other combo-oriented decks, Mystic Mine actually isn't too bad. So while the deck itself, as well as the card, isn't too viable now, that doesn't mean it won't be in the future. Same thing with Totally Awesome and good old Paleozoic, although Paleozoic, again, is a trap-focused deck, and there are some people that are really heavy on wanting to play Paleo now, just not really putting up the numbers to justify it. If you want to play a trap deck, play Eldritch, play Geist. Those are probably going to be better. Next up is Salamangreat, and I'm going to throw this into the Rogue tier. Now, at the top tiers of competitive play, you're not going to see too much Salamangreat, but if you actually look in the online environment, there are a lot of people playing the deck. The deck fares okay in this like slower control-based format. The engine's very concise. You can play a lot of hand traps or specific tech cards to really kind of hedge your bets that you can make Salamangreat good against them. But again, it's sort of like a jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none type of deck, and its win rate is actually fairly decent. It's like in the low to mid 50 percentile, and it's like one of the top 10 most decks played online right now, which is pretty respectable. So I actually wanted to throw this into the Rogue tier. Phantom Knight is a deck I'm going to throw this like into everything else. I guess I can put this towards like the top end of everything else, because if there's something that's like borderlining on Rogue, it's Phantom Knight. This deck just seems so good on paper, and then it just falls apart in the face of all the rest of these decks. The deck is so cool. I really wanted to do something, but it's just not seeing the play. It's not putting up the numbers, and so I gotta throw it into everything else. So this is actually an interesting one. So we have Gravekeeper's Commandant in here, and this is supposed to represent, I want to say it's going to represent Gravekeeper, but I want to talk about this a little bit more. This is, of course, going into everything else. However, this deck has access to Necro Valley, and having access to Necro Valley in this particular format is insane, because Necro Valley against these three decks in particular is actually super crazy, and there are some other decks that can just splash stuff like Commandant and Necro Valley in the deck because they don't care about any sort of graveyard interaction, which then allow them to play Necro Valley in addition to whatever it is that deck is doing. I'm talking about archetypes, let's say like Trickstar, but you can even play like a Dragoon sort of Gravekeeper deck, which actually did get a first place in a very small event, taking on all Drytron opponents and just completely wipe the board with them, because Necro Valley is just insane. So I might actually feature this deck on a deck of the week. We'll have to see, but this was just something interesting I wanted to quickly highlight. Now, next up is Shaddoll. A lot of you guys wanted my head last time because I didn't give this deck the respect it deserves, and to be fair, you're right. Now, I'm a little bit higher on Shaddoll this time around because A, it actually performed quite well this past weekend, but B, the way the meta's starting to trend, I actually think Shaddoll gets a little bit better because Winda is a card. Now, when you look at the fact that Dragon Link's moving up, Adamancipator's moving up, you have these combo decks that are starting to come up in tandem with Virtual World as well as Drytron being in the meta game, then that is where a deck like Dogmatica Shaddoll, or even just like a Trap Shaddoll deck in general, can actually see a lot of success. And so I'm a much stronger proponent of Shaddoll being a viable rogue option just because of the way the meta is starting to trend. Don't write this deck off. If you don't have a way to deal with Winda, this deck can and will hose you. Next up, we have Sky Striker. This is another rogue contender. What's cool about this is a lot of people are playing this deck pure. I think if there's any deck playing Mystic Mine still, it's probably Sky Striker just because it's a spell, let's be honest. But Sky Striker Eldritch is also another deck that people have been experimenting with and has seen a good amount of success lately. And so again, I still want to call that like a rogue deck, even though it does have Eldritch in it, but don't expect to see that too much. But the synergies there are actually kind of cool, and that might be the way to play Striker moving forward. But nonetheless, either way, it's still a rogue pick in my eyes, and that's where it's going to be. Prank Kids is another one I want to throw in rogue. This is something I used to have at like tier 2 from its representation, but this deck has definitely been on the decline. It really hasn't been putting up the numbers like it used to, and it hasn't been really putting up many results either. You're going to still see this deck a fair bit, but not nearly as much as you were in the past. Dinosaur, oh man, talk about a fall from grace. I think this is another one that's also in the rogue tier. Again, you can maybe move this up here because the thing is, Dinosaur is probably still one of the most played decks in the format, but the thing is, with so many people citing stuff like Artifact Lancia and the like, people are prepared to have this deck controlled, and because there's so many other cards that overlap with taking out Dinosaur as well, it really hinders Dinosaur's ability to be able to compete in this particular format. It's okay, it's fine, you'll see a reasonable amount of success with it, but don't be too surprised if you don't see too many dinosaurs running around like you used to. It definitely isn't the tier 1 threat that it once was. And last but not least, we've got just good old Zodiac. I'm going to throw this in just tier 2 because Zeus is just a house, and there's other like Zodiac-esque variants that are also running around too. Zeus is just crazy. I mean, Zeus just bolsters Zodiac's ability so far up the ladder, it's insane. And I figured if there's a spot to put just good old Zodiac, it's probably in tier 2. This is a lot of rogue options, but to be fair, I haven't really seen anything really excel one over another. You're seeing a lot of these decks being played in like very similar capacity. Again, if I had like a tier 2.5 or tier 3 category, I might put like Adamancipator, Liralusk Tri Brigade, and like Dino in there, because in that way you might start to see a little bit more of a differentiation, because these decks are definitely on the rise. You're going to see these more probably than the rest of these 6, but in any case, this is where the tier list stands. I think it's a pretty accurate representation of what the meta is looking like. Obviously, you guys can disagree with me down in the comments because this is just my opinion, but you can expect to see for sure Virtual World as well as Drytron as well as Eldritch at the top, and you can expect to see these decks a lot. And who knows, Blazing Vortex is right around the corner, and for all we know, maybe there's some people that have been labbing up some new crazy decks to play, so maybe the whole tier list will shift as we go into the rest of February and the early March format. And let's also not forget that we have a new ban list on the way as well. So if there's anything that's going to shake up this tier list, it's going to be a ban list, so oh man, I can't wait to see what happens. But guys, that's going to wrap it up for the video. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video informative, consider supporting me on Patreon for exclusive early one-day access to both the Yu-Gi-Oh progression series and the history of Yu-Gi-Oh. Thank you guys so much for watching the video, and we will see you next time.